Uranus is the seventh planet out from our Sun. It's so far away that it takes about 84 Earth years to orbit the Sun once. Because it's so far away from us, we didn't know much about Uranus until the Voyager 2 spacecraft visited it in 1986. Voyager discovered that Uranus defies evolutionary predictions in multiple ways. On the left, you see the planet as it appears to the eye. On the right is the planet with false colors added to exaggerate details. The spot you see here is the planet's south pole. Evolutionists had expected Uranus's poles to be on the top and bottom like all the other planets have. Instead, the poles are on the sides. It turns out that Uranus leans way over as it orbits the Sun. All the other planets spin like a top as they go around the Sun, but not Uranus. Uranus rolls along like a ball as it travels through space. Well, this creates a huge problem for evolution. According to the nebula theory, it's impossible for Uranus to have formed this way. Can you guess what the answer is? Yep, that's right. Uranus formed the right way up, as evolution predicts. But then an asteroid crashed into it and knocked it over. This was a really big asteroid, by the way, about the size of the entire Earth. But where's the evidence for this collision? There isn't any. In fact, there's lots of evidence that seems to be inconsistent with the collision. First of all, Uranus is quite stable as it rolls along through space. Its orbit around the Sun is almost perfectly circular. Plus, its orbit lies more closely within the plane of the ecliptic than any other planet besides Earth. Surely a massive collision wouldn't have produced such a perfect orbit. Also, Uranus has moons, over 24 of them in fact, as you see here. Plus, it has a faint ring system. Notice that all these moons are orbiting Uranus's equator. Now remember, the equator is angled up and down, instead of sideways like the evolutionists expected. So where did these moons come from? They couldn't have formed before the collision because they wouldn't be orbiting where they are today. And they couldn't have formed after the collision because Uranus was supposedly already formed when the collision occurred. They couldn't even have formed during the collision because their orbits are too regular. They do not look like they were involved in any sort of collision like this. Here's what one scientist said about Uranus's moons. And by the way, this man won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He said, "To place the Uranian satellites in their present, almost coplanar circular orbits would require all the trajectory control sophistication of modern space technology. It is unlikely that any natural phenomenon involving bodies emitted from Uranus could have achieved this result." I think we should recognize that no collision occurred. Uranus was apparently created just the way it is. Uranus causes lots of other problems for evolution too. First of all, Uranus is one of the 4 giant Jovian planets. The other 3 all generate energy. They radiate more energy into space than they receive from the Sun. Uranus is the only giant planet that doesn't do this. But why doesn't it? After all, these planets all supposedly formed at the same time, from the same materials, by the same natural processes. That means they should have turned out roughly the same. But Uranus is very different than the others in this important area. Another problem was discovered when Voyager flew by Uranus and measured the planet's magnetic field. Evolutionists had predicted that Uranus wouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Now, creationists weren't surprised when Uranus was found to have a magnetic field. 2 years before the Voyager probe reached Uranus, Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a Bible-believing physicist, had predicted the planet would have a magnetic field. Since the Bible says the Earth was made of water, Dr. Humphreys said, "What if all the planets were originally created from water? That would have certain implications for their magnetic fields today, 6,000 years later." So he calculated approximately how strong that field would be today. And when Voyager reached Uranus and took measurements, the evolutionists were wrong, and the creation-based prediction was right. There's more we could say about Uranus if we had the time. But before we leave this planet, I have to share with you one of my favorite objects in the solar system, Uranus's moon, Miranda. Miranda is a tiny little moon. It's only about 300 miles across, but it's one of the strangest objects in the solar system. Pity the poor evolutionist who has to explain this thing. The entire moon looks like a patchwork quilt, like it was glued together from a jumble of different pieces. How many different types of terrain can you identify here? There's long strips of rugged terrain, side by side with terrain that's smoother but more heavily cratered. Here's another example. Look at how dramatically the terrain changes from one section to another. It really looks like the moon was assembled from a bunch of separate pieces. Some sections look like someone painted it with a giant paintbrush. Other sections have very dramatic terrain, with canyons several miles deep. Let's look more closely at that cliff on the right. This cliff is about 6 miles high. Imagine standing at the top and looking down. And what's with that big check mark anyway? It's almost as if the creator said, "Ha! Let him try to explain this one." As one evolutionist said, "No one predicted anything looking like Miranda." Another said, "The central problem in modeling the thermal histories of the Uranian satellites is accounting for Miranda." So how do evolutionists explain Miranda? You're probably expecting me to say they explain it with an asteroid collision. Nope, not this time. Miranda is so weird, even the evolutionists admit that an asteroid collision won't help them. Instead, some evolutionists propose 5 collisions. Here's a quote from a NASA website. Scientists believe that Miranda may have been shattered as many as 5 times during its evolution. After each shattering, the moon would have reassembled from the remains of its former self, with portions of the core exposed and portions of the surface buried. If this sounds like nonsense, it's because it is. Even other evolutionists recognize that this tiny moon wouldn't necessarily survive 1 collision, never mind 5. As one evolutionary astronomer wrote, although some sort of collisional disruption appears to be required, it's not obvious that the present terrain, with relief up to 20 kilometers, would survive catastrophic disruption and reassembly. Maybe that's why that NASA website, after telling you about the 5 collisions, says this: Miranda's appearance can be explained by theories, but the real reason is still unknown. So first, they give you a theory, and then admit they actually don't know what happened. In other words, they made up a story and told it to you, even though they know it's not true. Wouldn't it be better just to acknowledge that these objects were created? So here's what you're not being told about Uranus. Evolution says it shouldn't be rotating sideways, but it is. Evolution says it shouldn't have its current magnetic field, but it does. Evolution says it should be radiating energy into space, but it isn't. And Miranda is a complete mystery.